Welcome to another episode of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Happy Monday, everyone. Hope everyone had a great weekend. Now, full disclosure, I am recording this before the Super Bowl is over, so at this point, I have no idea who won. But you do. So all I can say is that I hope it was a great game, and I hope the team you were rooting for, I hope they came through. I was home for this weekend, but on the road again this week. Headed to Arkansas for a couple days, spending the weekend in Denver, and then another stretch of trainings next week, back to Arkansas, Colorado, etc. I want to take the time right now, of course, to remind you of a few upcoming events. We've got the virtual Grading from the Inside Out 2-day training happening April 5th and 12th. We'll be face-to-face in Des Moines, Iowa, March 28-29, and San Antonio, Texas, April 25th and 26th. Standards-based learning in action will also be in San Antonio the 2 days following the Grading from the Inside Out training, April 27 and 28. So you could get 4 days in San Antonio and 4 days of training, 2 days on the mindset, 2 days on putting it into action. So like I said, 4 days in San Antonio is never a bad thing. All of the information for those events will be found on the Solution Tree website, and I'll have links in the show notes for all of them as well. Okay, as always, thanks for tuning in again this week. A big welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time, and a big thank you to longtime listeners. I appreciate all of you. This week, my guest is Allison Dillard. Allison is an adjunct math professor at Irvine City College, and she is the host of the Allison Loves Math podcast. So, of course, we're talking math today. Now, I know not everyone is a math teacher, but I promise you there is much in our conversation that is applicable to other subject areas as well. And in Assessment Corner this week, I'm going to continue my exploration of the importance of being trauma-informed with our assessment practices. And specifically today, I'm going to explore the impact trauma has on the brain and the assessment ramifications that could come with that. So, that's today's plan. Let's get to it. My conversation with Allison Dillard is coming up. But first, don't at me. But I want to open this week with a plea to all educators, maybe a plea to the entire world, and that is please leave Wordle alone. Now, in case you're not familiar with Wordle, it has been the viral hit of 2022 so far. It's this online daily word game. You can only play it once a day. Every 24 hours, there's a new word of the day, and it's up to you to figure out what that word is. Now, what Wordle does is it gives you, as a player, 6 chances to guess a randomly selected 5-letter word. If you have the right letter in the right spot, it shows up green. You have a correct letter, but it's in the wrong spot, it shows up yellow. And a letter that isn't in the word in any spot shows up gray. Now, you can enter a total of 6 words, meaning you could enter 5 burner words from which you can learn hints about the letters and their placements, and then you get 1 chance to put those hints to use. Or you can try to guess the word as you go along to try to get it in 3 chances or 2 chances or 4 chances or whatever. And I rarely latch on to these viral trends, but I saw people posting their results on Wordle, and I thought, well, what's this Wordle thing everybody's doing? And then I tried it, I liked it, and now I'm in. It's simple, but I find it incredibly compelling and fun. And we're already starting to ruin it. And I'm begging you, please stop. Now, it was inevitable that we would start ruining it by taking something fun and overanalyzing it, dissecting it, and trying to make Wordle be more than it is. It's just a fun word game, people. Now, look, I understand. We all want to win games. But are we now seriously hyper-focused on winning Wordle? It's challenging, especially on some days. But in some weird way, Wordle has offered me an escape from the busyness of my life. A chance to just do a quick word puzzle, guess correctly or not, and then get back to my real life. For me, it's fun. I post my results, as do many of my Facebook friends and my connections on Twitter. My buddy Steve and I, we text each other our results each day. It's just a fun thing to do. But now we're seeing the blog posts and articles talking about what's the best word to use at the beginning of your Wordle, or should you always use the same word for Wordle? No, I use the same word 50% of the time, and the other 50% of the time I'm hoping that I can guess the word in 1 or 2 tries. Why not? But it's all in good fun. And again, we're about to ruin it. I talked 2 weeks ago about ruining words. Well, now we're going to start ruining a fun game. Seriously, an entire blog post dedicated to the best Wordle strategy? Are we that fragile that if we don't guess a word in 6 tries, it's going to undercut our sense of self and make us feel less than others? Do you really feel some kind of superiority if you guess it in 6 or fewer tries? Like, what are we doing here? But, okay, look, you want to do well, you want a strategy. Okay, I'll give you that. Fine, you can have a strategy. But here's what I'm bracing for. And you know it's coming. It's probably already here. You know, the headline, What Your Wordle Strategy Says About Your Personality. God help me. 10 Things Your Wordle Obsession Reveals About Your Childhood. Wordle is like this mini crossword, one word every 24 hours. But once we educators start getting a hold of it, once we adults start overanalyzing it, we're going to destroy it. All right, kids, get out your phones. It's Wordle time. Let's go, right? And there'll be the kids who get it in 2 or 3 guesses, jumping out of their desks, celebrating like they just hit a game-winning shot in Game 7, making the others feel stupid. There'll be that one kid who's always super competitive with everyone, having a meltdown because it took 5 tries today instead of his usual 3, while his nemesis got it in 2. I must be getting dumber, he'll think. Then there'll be 3 kids doing it together in the back corner. Of course, the teacher will be calling out to them, "Hey, no cheating. You're supposed to be doing this on your own." There'll be 4 kids in the back of the room on TikTok who have no interest in doing Wordle at all. The teacher will confront them about being off task, and they'll say, "We don't care about Wordle. That's your thing." Well, they might not say it that way. Then there'll always be that one kid who ruins it for everyone by shouting out the word or using it in some way that's kind of an awkward sentence, like, "Boy, that Mr. Shimmer sure does have a great sense of humor." Humor was last Wednesday's word. I can see it. A fun activity ruined by an overzealous attempt to bring Wordle into the classroom. What your students' average Wordle score says about your early literacy program. There will be the inevitable international rankings on average Wordle scores, and even though it's in English and so much of the world doesn't speak English as a first language, I'm sure we'll hear how Canada ranks 9th and the United States ranks 13th in average Wordle scores. See what I did there? Then there'll be the inevitable backlash in the media calling for an overhaul of the education system, because if our kids can't figure out a 5-letter word in 6 guesses, how are we supposed to compete with the likes of China and India and Korea and Japan on a global stage? There'll be another call for the inevitable going back to basics. Project-based learning, how about we figure out 5-letter words first? Please don't. I'm begging you. Leave it alone. Just let it be what it is. A fun daily game that people seem to enjoy doing. I already see the Wordle shaming on social media if you accidentally make a mistake or don't get the right answer. You know, where you have 3 letters correct and then accidentally use a word with only 2 letters correct because you forgot to use the 3rd letter. Okay, yeah, it happens. But for those of you who do Wordle, I don't know about you, but I often do Wordle when I'm doing something else. It's not like I'm taking a serious test here where I have to focus and my livelihood depends on it. But I see posts and then it comments like, "Oh, wow, I was wondering what happened there." The Wordle arrogance is going to be nauseating. I can see it coming. And it has me worried, kind of legitimately, because what should be a fun game is going to be riddled with anxiety. And then there will be the anti-Wordle crowd that will refuse to try it just because it's trendy. I don't follow those frivolous trends. Everyone's doing it. Not me. I don't succumb to that societal peer pressure. God help us all. We have a chance, people. A chance to rewrite the script. A chance to forever change the future course of viral cognitive trends. We can do it. I know we can. I've seen this movie before, and I implore you, please, 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 for the sake of all humanity, please leave Wordle alone.
3, 2, 1.
Joining me today for the interview is Allison Dillard. Allison is a math professor at Irvine Valley College. She is the author of a number of math books, including The Love of Math Journal and Crush Hypothesis Testing. Allison is also the host of the Allison Loves Math podcast, and that is how I became familiar with Allison's work, as I am a subscriber to that podcast, and I love listening to it and learning about math, all things math with Allison. So would encourage you all to do that as well. So Allison, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Oh, thank you, Tom. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. I feel like I maybe need to consider a name change. Maybe I should change my podcast to Tom Loves Assessment or something like that in terms of, because I like the way the name of your podcast rolls off the tongue. So, looking forward to digging in. Math is always that, it is often a polarizing topic in education, the way people respond to it, the way students respond to it, the way parents respond to it. So I want to jump right in and get started with one of the biggest ideas, of course, has been, emerging in recent years. And certainly that's the concept of, people always refer to, oh, it's the new math versus the old math. I find the reference kind of funny in a way, because I kept thinking to myself, I don't think the math has changed. I'm pretty sure the numbers still work out the way they've always worked out. But I know what they're referring to, of course. They're referring to the different ways in which math is taught, the way math is sort of learned, the way students absorb it. So from your perspective, what are the essential elements of a modern math classroom, modern math instruction?
Oh, I think that's such a good point, because you're right. The math has not changed, right? Multiplication is still multiplication. Addition is still addition, right?
Yeah.
So none of that has actually changed. But you're right. The way that we're teaching math has changed, or we're trying to improve it, right? So the old way of teaching math was really simple and straightforward, right? You share a math concept in class. You do an example of it, and then you have the students practice. Right. And that's a really solid way of teaching, right? And a necessary way. We need to explain things to students. We need to have them practice. So it does have some of the really important elements of teaching that are still a part of new math. But I think what we're trying to do with modern math instruction is to improve upon that, right? To say, you know what, we can do that, but there's so much more that we can do. And if we consider all of the math anxiety and the hatred of math that's out there with students and parents and even some teachers, right? We know that there were some things missing from the way that we used to teach math, right? And so some of the things, that are emphasized now are sort of that difference between conceptual and procedural understanding of mathematics, right? Because before there would be a lot of, just repetition and repeating the procedure, right? So the students would know what to do, but not necessarily like why they were doing it, right? So it's tricky, I think, sometimes to get students to understand both. But I know that's one of the things that we're emphasizing now. Another is communication, right? Because I if you remember, growing up learning math, I mean, at least for me, we never really practiced explaining what we were doing, and so that whole skill set of discussing mathematics was not necessarily taught. And that is something that honestly I'm seeing so much. I see it with my kids and I love it so much whenever they come home from school. And, my first grader will say like, oh, I did this, in class. And honestly, like the next thing he always follows up with is, and do you want to know how I did it? Right. And then he shares his thought process with it. And I love so much that we're having this new generation of students who are always thinking about, well, how did I get to that answer? And that communication aspect is definitely part of modern math instruction.
Yeah. Absolutely. Your first grader knows you're going to ask anyway, so probably just offers it up ahead of time. One of the ways that I've often talked about it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the way that I've sort of talked about modern math instruction, and I think unfortunately for parents, they talk about the new math, but I think it's the difference between learning to do the math versus learning to understand the math, like knowing the math versus doing the math. Is that a fair way to kind of look at how math has evolved?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
And I teach math at the community college level, and I teach a lot of remedial math classes.
Okay.
So it's with students who didn't necessarily place into transfer level math, right? So they're the students with a lot of math anxiety and who need a lot of refreshers on the basics. And I think a really good example that I've come across over and over is Mixed numbers, I think, would be one, right? When they're taught mixed numbers in elementary school, right? You're changing the whole number, you're multiplying that by the denominator, you're going to add the numerator from the fraction part of it, right? And then you put the whole thing over the denominator, right? There's just a quick little process. I'm doing a horrible job of explaining it. It's a quick little process that's very easy to replicate. And once you practice it, 5 or 10 or 15 times, it's very easy to go through the motions of it, right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm seeing in college a lot is the students who knew the process of it, but had no idea why they were doing that process, right? The fact that we were taking that whole number and we're writing it so it has the same denominator as the other one, and why we need to have the same denominator in order to add two fractions, right? So that sort of deeper level of understanding for why you're doing that procedure is really important.
Yeah, the unfortunate part around, well, I have a rule, by the way, Allison, whenever never do math publicly. That's kind of the rule I have for my workshops or anything like that. So that's one of my rules. So don't worry about the explanation as you were going along there. But again, it's one of those things where math was so often taught about follow the procedure or the trickery, multiplying, by 9. And for example, there's that trick where, take one off the number, 9 times 6 is, you take one off, it's 5, the digits add up to 9. So therefore it has to be 54. But that's a shortcut to getting to understand. So I think that's a really important shift that we've seen. And I don't think that shift is unique to math necessarily, in that in so many subjects, standards are getting more sophisticated, and therefore we're expecting students to do a deeper level of thinking. One thing that I absolutely encounter a lot when I'm working with math teachers from an assessment perspective is this kind of if-then approach to the overarching mathematical practices that are often emphasized throughout the standards. Kind of leaves them stuck in a way. And here's what I mean by that. Some teachers will say to me, and this is not most or many, but some teachers will say to me, Tom, how am I supposed to get the students to the mathematical practices, things like constructing a valuable argument or critiquing the reasoning of something? How do we get to those practices when my students can't even solve basic equations, or they struggle with adding and subtracting fractions or basic skills like that? But we know, of course, you and I know, that those practices are transferable, and they actually represent a deeper level of understanding in the deeper side of mathematics. Now, obviously, and I know this question is a bit long-winded, but I want to set you up for your perspective here. So we know to think critically, you have to think about something. There has to be substance there. There has to be some competence that's necessary. But from your perspective, when you think about those mathematical practices that are longitudinal and they kind of transfer throughout the entire subject, regardless of the content, what's the best way to incorporate those practices into math instruction?
I think it's a really good question. I don't know that there's one best way, or if there is, I don't want to claim that there is, right?
Okay.
Because
Okay.
different things work for different teachers, right? And even as an individual teacher, you'll find that different things work for different classes, different groups of students, different subjects. And addressing the issue of foundations, right? Because I know that's
Mhm.
something that I've struggled with, that so many teachers struggle with, is we get students into our math classes who don't have the foundations they need to succeed in that math class, right? They've been passed along too many years, and they're in calculus, but they don't know algebra 1 basics, right? Sort of at the
Mhm.
extreme. And so I guess a general answer to that would be, the best way to do it is to get your teachers comfortable with experimenting how to incorporate the mathematical practices, understanding that the first thing that you try might not work, and if you
Mhm.
try lots of different things, you'll find what works for you. Right. And so, I think one of the things that you mentioned was the constructing viable arguments, right? And critiquing the reasoning of others. So
Mhm.
basically, explaining what you're thinking, and learning to talk to other students about what you're thinking. And you can do that with students who are behind, who don't know their foundations. In fact, that can be really helpful. And you can start those conversations around the mistakes that they're making, right?
Mhm.
Students can learn to talk about their mistakes, right? And ask questions about them and have conversations with others about how to fix it and how to do things correctly. That's helping them immensely, right? While also helping them to learn how to communicate about math.
Mhm. You said something there about knowing foundations, and I mentioned that, having that foundational piece, and it just made me think about how do we tell the difference? How does a math teacher, because we know mistakes are inevitable. Kids are going
Mhm.
to make errors. It's going to happen. 4 times 3 becomes 7. That happens. That doesn't necessarily mean I don't conceptually understand what I'm doing. It just means that I made a simple mistake. Is it that simple that I look for simple mistakes versus egregious misunderstandings? Or where does a teacher draw the line? Like, how would a math teacher know that despite the errors, the student still has that foundational piece versus they don't have the foundational piece? What are some of the indicators that a math teacher might look for?
Well, my background in that really comes from tutoring. I did a lot of math tutoring, starting in high school, through college, and throughout my 20s. And one of the things that I found was that my students always would come to me and say, "Well, I just make careless errors. I
Hmm.
just make careless errors, and that's the reason there's, obviously I know how to add, obviously I know how to multiply. If you're in higher levels of math, it's, obviously I know my order of operations."
Hmm.
Right? Because when they look back at it and somebody explains it to them, they say, okay, that makes sense. I can understand that. But that's a different level of understanding than knowing how to multiply or do your order of operations
Hmm.
sort of automatically and without mistakes in the context of a larger, more complicated problem.
Hmm.
So, back when I was tutoring, one of the things that I would always do with my students was I'd say, "Well, let's look at all of your work and let's go through all of your mistakes." And sure enough, there were always these repeated mistakes, right? That they would make over and over and over again. So they would think that they say, "I'm just bad at math," or "I have math anxiety," or "I make careless errors." When really, when we could actually pinpoint, here are like the 6 things that you need to go back and
Hmm.
work on, right? Then all of a sudden, those careless errors start disappearing, right? They're able to actually focus on whatever the current material is because they're not stressing out in their mind about like, "Oh, what was 6 times 7 again?"
Yeah. Is always an interesting just idea around foundational skills because I think in some respects we have fed this beast of perfection that you just cannot if you make any errors. And there are times I suppose where in any subject there can be a kind of arrogance about that emerges, maybe infuses into the way that it's being taught, and it kind of makes me think about the lead into the next question I want to ask you, which is when we think about math, and I think if we're being honest, and we asked most adults which subject in school, pound for pound, caused them the most stress and anxiety, it's undoubtedly going to be math, right? So we know that math explains the world, and that's the importance of math. That math is everywhere, but we also know, and I love this expression. I can't remember where I picked this up, but I picked it up somewhere where someone said, math takes their lunch money every day in some respects, and that's the way they kind of look at math and the way adults have looked at math. So this is sort of a two-part question here, Allison. First, do you think it's the nature of the subject itself, or is it the traditional way that math had been taught before that kind of led to these emotional, kind of almost primal reactions that students and adults have about math? So that's the first part. And the second part then would be that if that's true, how do we change it so math is not wrongly seen as this academic bully?
All right. So your first question is whether or not, the math itself, right, causes math anxiety
Right.
versus how we're teaching it. That's the first
Right.
question, right? All
Right.
right.
How is it how we teach it, or is it the nature of the subject itself that leads to those emotional reactions?
Right. So I don't know if there's a clear-cut answer there, right? Because I think when I think about just the nature of math, I do think about public speaking for myself, right? The
Mhm.
first time I wrote a book and I realized that I was gonna have to go out and talk to people about it, it was terrifying, right? And I never had any sort of, education or bad educational experiences around
Mhm.
speaking. But just the idea of it terrified me.
Mhm.
And so I do think there could be an element of that with math, right? You're looking at numbers and you're looking at variables. So I think for some students, there could be just a natural reaction to that. But
Mhm.
I do think a lot of it can come from how we're teaching math and what the specific experiences are that students have had. So one of the very first interviews that I did on my podcast was with Professor Maria Ryan, who has a PhD specifically in math anxiety. And
Mm.
one of her research papers that she did was talking about the the effect of talking with students about what caused their math anxiety, like what experience caused it, and how, basically, what we ended up talking about was by pinpointing, right, what was that bad experience? And a lot of times it comes back to, like, parents saying, like, oh, they're just so bad at math, or a teacher telling a student that they're really bad at math, right? Or maybe being embarrassed. There's so many different things that could cause it, but by being able to go back and pinpoint what that one experience was that
Mhm.
sort of kickstarted the math anxiety can help students so much, because they start to realize that, it's caused by something. It's not who they are, right? And who they are can change. Their relationship to math can change, right? And so, sort of by identifying that, it can be really helpful for students.
Yeah. It's yeah, for me when I was in school, I mean, I did pretty well in math and I liked math. And as I told you prior to our interview, that I had almost thought about becoming a math teacher and had taught math for a few years in middle school math when I was an assistant principal. But it's always interesting that, the way math was taught before, that it seemed like I think the part of it is the nature of you're either right or you are infinitely wrong. And that can be somewhat debilitating to people. And so I sort of feel like the way that math is being taught now in terms of critical thinking, in terms of, explaining the math, understanding the conceptual sort of intricacies of why, a squared plus b squared equals c squared or whatever it might be. I think that is lending itself to maybe reducing some of the stress about just simply focusing on right answers and not understanding the depths of the procedures or the processes that you might go through. I'm wondering about now 21st century skills. We talk about, and you've mentioned a few of these, but I want to take a deeper dive into each of these as we think about some of the big sort of 21st century skills that often get talked about, the four C's, if you will. Critical thinking is obviously all over math. We everything about math can lend itself to critical thinking, and we talked a little bit about having those foundational pieces so you can think critically, because thinking critically is analyzing, it's critiquing, it's hypothesizing, it's synthesizing, it's doing all of those things that we often incorporate into math instruction. But I want to talk about each of the other big three, if you will. And so I'm going to do these one at a time, Allison. So let's talk first about collaboration. If we wanted to bring more collaboration into a math classroom, and I don't know that it's just specific to math, it's probably something you could do in any subject, but let's talk specifically about the math classroom. How do we what do you see as the way that teachers can begin to infuse more collaboration into the math classroom?
Well, collaboration's working with other students, right? So I think once we
Yeah.
step away from maybe just the individual drills and worksheets, right, which are the easiest thing to do in math
Mm.
class, and step into, more sort of, um, I don't know, group projects, right? Whether it's a challenge question or just an open-ended question, perhaps math
Mhm.
relating to real life, something
Mhm.
where they can't just answer it all on their own, and it's good to have different perspectives. As you're working through solving some sort of problem, that's hugely fun and also helpful for students, right?
Mhm.
Having those collaboration type projects. Now, that being said, I will admit, from working at a community college, um, most of our resources that we have, don't really lend itself to those projects that have collaboration, right, and
Right.
communication and all of those other things. And
Sure.
so I was thinking back to one of the ones I did in my statistics class, which was a Powerball handout, right? And it
Okay.
was, we're looking at the lottery, and basically, should you put money towards the lottery, or should you save it and invest it, right?
Mm.
And it was very open ended. And it was actually helpful that I didn't actually do the work myself. I didn't have a specific answer. So there really was no way for me to guide them through, the different steps. And it was very open-ended and helpful. And I think the challenge with doing those sorts of things in math class is that we have so many different subjects and that we need to get through in a given semester, right? That it can be
Mhm.
really hard to lose like a class towards something like this. But at the same time, it's really good to expose our students to these different types of projects. And
Mhm.
so I'm trying. Sorry, I got off on a, a random
No,
tangent
it's
there.
okay. It's okay.
I
No, this
guess
is
my
good. This is
answer
good.
is to try it, right?
Yeah.
And not that like a Powerball handout is exactly the thing that everybody should do in statistics, but I think that sometimes getting out of your comfort zone on the assignments, and trying
Mhm.
something new and understanding that some students might get frustrated with it. You might not introduce it the best way the first time, but just the
Mhm.
fact that you're trying something different is helpful for
Yeah.
both the students as well as for you.
Yeah. As you were responding there, it also made me think about the opportunity for students to simply hear from others,
Mhm.
because I think one of the things that maybe some of our students who might initially struggle with some things conceptually is they don't have access to how maybe some of our stronger performing students approach a problem. And by putting them into a collaborative team and having them do a think aloud about how to approach the problem, you may even just simply provide opportunities for students to get access to other students thinking about how they would approach a problem, and that could help them build foundation in that as well. So it may not even have to be about a project, but thinking on more of a micro level, that maybe it's just an opportunity for them to talk about their learning and talk about how they would approach the subject area or the problem or whatever the case might be. Can we talk a little bit about communication? You'd mentioned this earlier in our conversation, just about incorporating more communication, formal and informal. What would that look like in math? I mean, obviously, we know when you're answering a question, you are in some ways communicating, but we're obviously talking about some different ways of communicating in a math classroom. So, is that about the explanations, what does that look like in a math classroom?
Well, going back to that statistics example, I think there's a lot of different benefits, right, to learning how to communicate, regarding math. And I like what you were saying actually about
Mm.
it enabling different students to work together, right? And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I do these group assignments, is because gosh, I always notice it's like the failing
Mhm.
students are just drawn to the other failing students, and the A students are drawn to the other A students. And it's like, well, how is the student who's not going to pass the class going to change, right, if all they're doing is working with other students who also don't know what they're doing? And so
Right.
that is so helpful. And I think that another thing is that we're trying to teach more about growth mindset, right, and learning from
Mhm.
mistakes in our discussions. And by having these discussions with our classmates, whether it's just about the regular homework assignments or about some different project that you put together, it's enabling students to share ideas that don't always work and learn that it's okay, right? It's okay to put
Mhm.
your idea out there and have it be wrong, because that's still going to lead to somewhere else. And so I think that helps them to see the value in mistakes,
Mhm.
which is something that's really helpful for math, right? When students understand that it's supposed to be hard, it's not supposed to be easy, right? And you're supposed to make mistakes, right?
Right.
It's not a bad thing when you make a mistake. It's part of the learning process. And as much as we can tell students that it's okay to make mistakes, when they're seeing that their tests are 100% about not making mistakes, there's
Right.
this a disconnect between what we're
Mhm.
telling them and what they're seeing. And those assignments where you have conversation is just sort of a different way of teaching them that it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah, it often gives teachers access to student thinking, right? Having them communicate
Mhm.
why they approach the problem the way they did. For me, from an assessment perspective, it's you can see the answer is incorrect, but or you can see that it's correct, but understanding why or how they approach the problem and getting access to their thinking can be very helpful for a teacher to understand what interventions come next and how they can communicate. What about creativity? We're not when we talk about creativity, of course, we're not talking about just something that's aesthetically pleasing. That's a very narrow view of critical thinking. I tend to adopt the Howard Gardner definition, which is thinking in ways outside of our habitual ways of thinking. Like, Howard Gardner is famous for saying that, to think outside the box, there has to be a box. So we have to know some things, but how do we incorporate, outside of habitual thinking into a math classroom? What are some ways that we might be able to approach creative thinking in a math classroom?
I think one of the ways is relating math to real life, um, in an authentic way, right? And a lot of times
Mm.
that comes back to financial mathematics, right?
Right.
Which, when I was teaching college algebra, I felt like that was such a fun class because it related
Mhm.
so much to math in real life. And
Mhm.
I remember I had a student who came to me after class one day and said, okay, I was going over, what we were talking about, with different equations, and I was trying to work out how long it'll take me to save up for a motorcycle. And will you
Mhm.
check my math on this? And I thought, that's a great exercise, right? Have everybody saving for something, right? Everybody has some sort of financial
Right.
goal, right? Whether it's to pay for college or pay off debt or, eventually buy a house. And so, I think the creativity can come from finding things that the students care about,
Mhm.
right? That are open-ended questions. They can go as deep into it as they want with the calculations, or they can look at it in a more general sense.
Yeah.
But I think that's where that creativity comes in, which is a very different sense of creativity than I think you'll find in other classes.
Yeah. Are there, when you think about problems where there are multiple ways to approach the problem, or that's sort of, how would you approach this problem, or trying to adapt with under certain conditions or certain circumstances? Certainly, I don't know specifically what I'm talking about because I'm not. A high school or a college level math teacher, but conceptually, I'm thinking about problems where there are multiple ways to approach the problem, or there are maybe some unorthodox ways to approach a problem. Is that something that you could see incorporating as students move into higher levels of, I mean, you could probably incorporate that into younger grade levels as well, but I'm just thinking about as math expands for students and getting into some of the into pre-calculus, calculus, et cetera. Do you see that as something that might be able to be incorporated into a classroom?
Yes, I think one of the things that I found very helpful about the lottery example,
Hmm.
was, when students presented the different things that they did, some groups, like, they dove deep into calculating the probability that they would win, right, over a certain period of time.
Right.
Others just talked at length about, all of these assumptions. What are the assumptions? It's a very vague question, right?
Hmm.
How long are we doing this? How much money are we making? What rate of return might you get? Otherwise, there were so many unknowns that they were discussing. And so,
Hmm.
the the really cool thing about that, though, was that when they shared what they had discussed, you could see that there were so many different ways, to tackle the exact same problem.
Hmm. Money and sports are a lot of ways in which are ways that we certainly can enter math, right? There's kids say I can't do math, but they can calculate the wins above replacement for their favorite first baseman on their team, or they can calculate someone's efficiency rating in the NBA, or look at all sorts of statistics, or think about from a financial perspective, right? Money and sports seem to be seem to be some of the entry point for students when it comes to math, for sure. Even if they say they can't do math, they typically can, and that might be the point of entry. So finding those places to bring some of that authenticity into instruction. Okay, I want to finish up here talking a little bit about we've kind of danced around. You've talked about that lottery idea, and I want to think about project-based learning or inquiry-based learning, because certainly we are seeing many teachers these days incorporating very student-driven, student-centered approaches to learning. But often, again, often not always, but a lot of math teachers will tell me that that doesn't really apply to math, or that you can do projects in social studies and history, and you can do projects in ELA and science, but that doesn't really apply to mathematics. I don't agree with them, but that's sort of the assertion. So, what are some ways that projects or inquiry based learning approaches can be brought into the math classroom kind of seamlessly and naturally, in ways that sort of enhance the experience for students?
Right. So I think when we hear teachers say that, the projects aren't relevant to math, what they maybe don't realize, or aren't actually saying, but what they mean is that they don't know how, right? They don't know what project to do. They don't know how to integrate it into the class in a way that's useful. They're, you know, probably, thinking, gosh, if I tried to do something like that, where do I even start? Where do I learn about it? That's so much time. I don't have the time to prep something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think there's a whole lot underneath that maybe they don't realize, right?
Right.
And so, I think, I did a podcast interview with a couple of math professors, from Slippery Rock University, Janet Asher and Jeffrey Messett, and they have this, statistics project that they do. And basically what they do in their math class is they use statistics like as a tool to help students become better citizens, right? So they, whatever their project is, it's actually a larger project with an organization in the community. And they create a math project with this organization that is something that will like benefit the community, right? We're analyzing data for an organization on something that will help them make some sort of decision. And so I think it's absolutely possible to create really powerful projects and experiences for students in the math classroom. But that being said, I think that for them to do something like that, right? To spend a lot of their time in class incorporating a project like that, there needs to be support for the teachers in order to do that, right? And so I think, at their school, they have an office, they have the support of the department, as well as just, people helping them to develop these things. And so, I think when teachers are reluctant to do that, a helpful thing to ask is, how can we make them feel safe trying something new? Especially given the fact that, if we're doing a project and students aren't used to it and the teacher isn't used to presenting it, it's possible that you'll hit a train wreck of a project in there, right? And the teacher needs to feel like you've got their back if it doesn't go well, right? That is the growth mindset that we try to teach our students about math, right? You make a mistake, it's okay, you learn from it, you do it better next time. We need to make it similar for teachers, right? It's okay to try that project. If it didn't work, you learn from it and it'll go better, or you'll do a different project next time.
Yeah. Sometimes I think the word project gets in the way of some teachers understanding what we mean, because I think that the quintessential project is that we've constructed something that, we come to school Monday morning with the volcano or the castle, or we've created this tangible. And I think when we talk about a project in math, it just makes me think of a deeper dive, taking a more expansive sort of deeper dive, because you're right. You look at, whether it's in politics where we look at statewide or national polling or provincial polling or wherever we might look at, understanding what our margin of error represents. There are so many ways that you can analyze dissect data as an example, and taking a deeper dive on that is another way to incorporate projects in the classroom. So I think a lot of the key is just expanding, the understanding of what we mean when we say these things, so that math teachers have the opportunity to not have a narrow view. And I don't know that they do. I just hear these things occasionally, and I just think it's important that we try to help help them understand that it isn't just this narrow view of building a diorama in your math class. There's a lot more to taking a deeper dive. Okay, 2 questions left, Allison, as we finish up today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. But these are 2 questions that I ask everyone I bring on the podcast in an interview. And here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction that you'd like to. But the first question is, educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
So, since I started writing math books, I've gotten this opportunity to meet so many other authors and bloggers and speakers in the math arena, and I realized there are so many people working so hard, right, to improve how it is that we're teaching math. And I think you had actually talked in a recent episode, right, about the timeline for change, right? When you meet with schools, early on, there's the early adopters who are really gung-ho, but then there's those teachers who are more reluctant, right? And that gradually changes over time.
Right.
And, I related to that a lot because I see that so much in math specifically, right? We've got the early adopters and we're so gung-ho and we want to change everything, but it's all of, it's those that are more reluctant, right? The late adopters, if you will. Right. And so I think the thing that keeps me up at night is, how do we make it easier for those late converters, right? How do we make teaching growth mindset easier for them, right? To see the value in it, to see how they can do it effectively in class. How can we bring those project-based learning experiences, right, to class? How do we help them to see the value in it and give them the confidence to try it, right? And have a growth mindset about trying it in their classroom. So I think, when it comes to teaching growth mindset across a school, right, or a district, right, keeping that in mind, how can we make it easier for teachers, I think that's going to help it to catch on. So that's kind of the question
Yeah.
now that keeps me up at night.
Yeah. I think everybody who's involved in trying to initiate and sustain some kind of change in a school is always concerned about how do we make this more accessible? How do we give people opportunities to enter safely into this change process and let them get messy a little bit with the
Mhm.
change? Okay, last question, Allison. It's a question about success. It's a pretty simple question. If a random person stopped you on the street, looked you in the eye, and said, "What's your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
I think it would be, are you making the world a better place? Right. And it doesn't have to be something big, one student or one class, one department, right?
Mhm.
If you're doing work that's leaving the world a little better off, you're being successful.
Yeah, I think that's always a great goal. I think that's a great definition of success. If you're contributing and you're leaving the world a better place, I think that's a wonderful place to finish up today. Listeners, you can definitely follow, and you should follow Allison on Twitter. Her handle on Twitter is at Allison Loves Math, but loves is spelled Luvs. You're not making this easy on people, Allison. But on Instagram, it's the same handle, except loves is spelled Loves. So it's at Allison Loves Math on Instagram. Loves is spelled the proper way, I suppose. And on Twitter, it's at Allison Loves Math, Luvs. Is how we spell loves. Allison also has the Allison Loves Math Facebook page. And of course, you can subscribe to the Allison Loves Math podcast. I will have links for all of that in the show notes so you can connect with Allison that way. Allison, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me here, Tom. This was lots of fun, and I just want to say that I really, really enjoy your podcast. You are putting so much helpful information out there for educators, and I'm really honored to get to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you saying that. Thanks, Allison.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcast. Now let's get back to the episode.
In Assessment Corner this week, I want to continue to explore this idea of trauma-informed assessment practices by highlighting a few big ideas about trauma that are coming clear to me as I read the book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. Now, if you're new to the podcast, I would encourage you to pause right now, download last week's episode, and at least listen to the Assessment Corner segment. You can fast forward through the other two parts if you need to or want to. Listen to them later, maybe. But part one from last week is where I talk about the emotional side of assessment, and this will help make this week's content make a little bit more sense. Now, the title of the book I'm reading right now, What Happened to You?, represents the overarching mindset that we should adopt when it comes to trauma. Namely, rather than asking what's wrong with you when a student acts in ways that are counter to social norms or in ways that are out of proportion to the circumstances, we need to start asking what happened to you. Now, last week I talked about Hendry Weisinger and J.P. Pauli Fry and their research that surrounded pressure and the difference between stress and pressure, and how conflating the two is one of the reasons why people, not just students, why people act in ways that are out of proportion to the circumstances. Now, in this book, Dr. Perry highlights that all brain function depends on the state we're in, and that the continuum literally from the brainstem to the cortex explains why we act the way we do, especially when we've experienced trauma. Our state of being drives our brain function, and our brain function is what drives our behavior. In other words, as we move from one internal state to another, there will be a shift in the parts of the brain that are in control. So when we're at our most relaxed, we are in that calm phase, right? And this is where we are so relaxed that we can let our minds wander. And this is often where people daydream and think internally, right? We are operating from our cortex. Dr. Perry calls that the smartest part of our brain, and we are at our most reflective. Now, sometimes we are on alert, okay? And this is where we start to focus a little bit. And we focus on one particular aspect of our external world, right? So we go from internal to external. Something happens, we kind of go, that's interesting. We're also operating from our cortex. And most, well-regulated people can operate between the calm and alert stage almost their entire day. But here's where we flock, if you will. And we ask the questions of others like, is it just me? Did you notice that? Am I misinterpreting that? Is that something I should pay attention to? So we get alerted, and then we start to seek confirmation from other people to say, am I crazy, or did I hear that right? Or what is the case? Okay. So then from there's the state of alarm. So sometimes we're not just attentive and alerted, but we are challenged, or we're surprised, or we're threatened, right? So now we start to think more emotionally. We act less mature. We say things we regret. And we typically argue through emotions, and things get a little personal. So here's where we're operating in our limbic area, right? And this is where people typically kind of freeze and are alarmed and startled, and we're just sort of stuck. Then there's fear. When we experience fear and we're facing a real threat, we start to focus more on the moment. Our problem-solving skills deteriorate, and this is the stage of flight. And we're operating from the diencephalon, and I hope I said that right. Not an expert on the brain, but this is where we start to disassociate, and we want out of here. Okay. And prolonged extreme stress can leave some people stuck at this stage of fear. So remember that when we talk about prolonged stress. And then, of course, there's terror. And terror, real terror, has us at a reflexive stage. And this is where we operate from our brainstem. And this is the stage of fight. This is where we're just, we're totally afraid. So now this is the part that I thought was so interesting. In the way Dr. Perry phrased this on page 92, he said, the hypervigilance of the alert state often gets mistaken for ADHD. The resistance and defiance of the alarm and fear stage often gets mistaken for oppositional defiant disorder. The flight stage often gets students suspended from school, and the fight behavior leads to suspensions and maybe even down the road charges of assault. And this is really critical. He just talks about how the pervasive misunderstanding of trauma-related behavior has a profound effect on our education, our mental health, and juvenile justice systems. Now that's intense. So in essence, the more threatened someone feels, the more control of functioning shifts from our higher systems, like the cortex, down to our lower systems, which is the brainstem. Our brains are organized to act and feel before we think. Okay, so that's the first part. Now here's the second part, and then we're going to bring this back to assessment. When a challenge or stress occurs, according to Dr. Perry, it puts us out of balance, and our internal stress response is activated. Okay, so when someone has what Dr. Perry calls a neurotypical stress response system, there is a linear relationship between the degree of stress and the shift of our internal state. So imagine, if you will, a graph that has an X and Y axis, right? So our Y axis would be our state, and the X axis, say, is the degree of stress. A neurotypical response relationship would be a 45-degree diagonal line, right? The greater the stress, the more significant the internal shift, but it's proportional, and to the outsider it would make sense. Oh, it makes sense you're acting that way because of the degree of stress that you're experiencing. But now someone who has a sensitized stress response system due to their history of trauma, even the most basic daily challenges will induce a feeling of fear. Moderate stress can induce terror. So rather than a 45-degree angle, the line is going to sharply move upward through alert, alarm, and fear, even with the most basic, and what I mean by basic is as seen by others, the most basic challenges. It accelerates from there and then flattens at the top. So the line sort of bows outward, if you will. It sharply goes up and then flattens out near the top. So as a contrast, someone who is resilient would have the opposite line. It would stay flat for longer periods of time, only to sharply curve upward under the most extreme conditions. Now, for the student who has the sharp line and is experienced sensitized, they have a sensitized trauma response system, and the line sharply goes up and their reactions are quite accelerated. That overactivity is going to be physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausting, and it's going to contribute to an array of problems that the student will have to overcome. Okay, so our response systems are different based on our history with trauma and our experience. Okay, so let's now talk assessment. Now, next week, I'm going to do a think aloud about some specific strategies, but here's what I'm thinking right now about trauma-informed assessment practices. I can see there being both an indirect and a direct impact on assessment based on a student's state. So let's first talk about indirectly. Now, it's easy to slip into a view that our classrooms are a vacuum. But in reality, our students are constantly impacted by the world around them, and of course, their internal brain function. Our students' sensitized response systems may be activated long before they enter your classroom. So for elementary students, it could be the result of something that happened between them and a parent or just prior to arriving at school that day, because usually elementary teachers have their students for the majority of the day, so they have a little more intimate awareness about what's been happening throughout the day as it unfolds. But for secondary students, high school, middle school, it could also be that, an exchange could also be, the parent or the situation at home, but it could also be an exchange or an incident that happened during the last class period just prior to arriving at your door. Now, being aware of the characteristics that typically manifest during the calm phase helps us recognize when agitation occurs or an aversive situation has occurred for that student. So it may not be the assessment itself, but the student's state will for sure have an impact on how well they're able to demonstrate their learning on an assessment. Something may have occurred, they hit that flight stage, and then they leave school. So it'd be easy for the teacher to say, or the administration to say, oh, for sure he skipped class because he knew there was a test today and he didn't study, he didn't prepare. He knew he was going to fail, so he just took off. Act like he doesn't care about school. Yes, the student left the school, but maybe not for the reasons you think. So that, in a nutshell, just being mindful that, the indirect impact that, our students' state is going to impact how they can demonstrate their learning, even if it's not the assessment itself that serves as the trigger. There's that direct impact, essentially, in a nutshell, right? So I know there's more detail and nuance to it for sure, but that's kind of what I'm thinking right now from an assessment perspective, is be aware that when students hit that level of agitation or they have an accelerated sort of continuum through the alert phase and then the alarm phase and then the fear phase, they may come to us not in the state of mind at all ready to demonstrate their learning. Okay, let's now talk about directly. Assessments themselves can be a trigger for some students, not just the feelings that are elicited during the experience, but the possible trauma that has occurred at home or within peer groups, as a result of the assessment experience. A student may, for example, have a history of trauma from a parent when poor assessment results have occurred. So the trigger itself is the prospect of being assessed because of the potential fallout that could occur afterwards. The anticipation of yet another poor result could be a trigger in and of itself. This is what I'm thinking here, okay? So this is just me thinking aloud. I feel like I'm onto something here, but I still have to crystallize these thoughts, going forward. So fear can be very quickly induced if the student knows that a poor result on an assessment may result in psychological or even physical harm. So the safest route in their mind might be to skip the assessment altogether, right? Flight. Because, flight is associated with the state of fear, right? So on the surface, it looks to us like the student didn't care about school, but really that student is thinking about the potential fallout of another poor assessment result. So in their eyes, no result is actually better than a poor result. Look, I'm not having the ability and pretending that I can read every student's mind, but this is what it makes me think of. The prospect of being assessed triggers a disproportionate emotion, and you end up eliciting kind of and triggering the stress response system. So a neurotypical student will have a proportional response to the stress of that situation. But if they have a sensitized response system, you'll see an acceleration through different states, which quickly moves to the part of the brain that is more emotional, it's more impulsive, and it's more protective. So we on the surface may misinterpret that as the student not caring about school or overreacting or being dramatic or anything like that. But it really is more primal than that. It's a response. It's their response system. And if they have that sensitized response system, you're going to see this accelerate quite quickly. So remember, our students will have an emotional reaction to the prospect of being assessed. Now, the question is whether or not that response will be productive or counterproductive, right? Now, students who have experienced trauma are more likely to conflate stress and pressure, like we talked about last week, therefore are more likely to escalate and accelerate their brain state from calm to and reflective to fear and creating that sense of flight, where they're acting with the lower regions of the brain, causing them to react more emotionally than cognitively, right? So for me, that conflating of stress and pressure and that overreaction really can often be sourced by the part of the brain that is in control of their behavior. So long and repeated stretches of stress and pressure associated with assessment could leave students in a perpetual state of alarm and fear, which will have a long-term impact on their mental, their physical, and their emotional health. Assessment can be a direct trigger of an accelerated state, whether it's an experience from the past or the anticipation of the potential responses that parents, caregivers, families, and other significant people in their lives might have. Again, assessment is as pressure-packed as anything young people experience, so that alone means we must be trauma-informed with not just the routines around assessment, but the execution of the assessments themselves. I think there are many things we can do to try to mitigate some of these issues proactively, or maybe just reduce the intensity of them. So we're going to talk about some of the strategies we might utilize next week.
3, 2, 1.
Okay, that's it for this week. Remember to follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Also, please email the podcast, tomshimmerpod@gmail.com, if you've got questions for Assessment Corner, or if there's just suggestions you have or guests you want to see on the podcast. A reminder to check out the show notes for the links for the upcoming Grading from the Inside Out and Standards-Based Learning in Action trainings coming this spring. Next week, my guest will be my friend, Tim Cavey. Tim is a middle school vice principal and the host of the Teachers on Fire podcast, so we're going to dig into a number of different topics. Tim is a real deep thinker about education, and I'm looking forward to that conversation as well. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts, but anywhere you can leave a review would be most appreciated. And if you like what you hear, please keep spreading the word about the podcast to your friends and colleagues or on social media. I would really appreciate that. Have a great week, everyone.